Hi, I'm Rashonda Kate. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. We are on chapter 15, which is a monster chapter. We are on our second installment of chapter 15, so let's get cracking. We had just read, oh, that's right. We stopped reading because I was mad at Mrs. Lincoln and her letters about come immediately. So we just finished reading her letters. And Mrs. Keckley writes, I transcribed the letter literally. In reply to Mrs. Lincoln's last question, I explained what has already been explained to the reader, that I was in hope she would change her mind and knew that it would be impossible to secure the rooms requested for a person unknown to the proprietors or attachés of the hotel. The explanation seemed to satisfy her. Turning to me suddenly, she exclaimed, You have not had your dinner, Lizzie, and must be hungry. What a non sequitur. I nearly forgot about it in the joy of seeing you. You must go down to the table right away. She pulled the bell rope, and a servant appearing, she ordered him to give me my dinner. I followed him downstairs, and he led me into the dining hall and seated me at a table in one corner of the room. I was giving my order when the steward came forward and gruffly said, You are in the wrong room. I was brought here by the waiter, I replied. It makes no difference. I will find you another place where you can eat your dinner. Let's keep reading and see what manner of injustice this is. I got up from the table and followed him, and when outside of the door, said to him, It is very strange that you should permit me to be seated at the table in the dining room, only for the sake of ordering me to leave it the next moment. Are you not Mrs. Clark's servant? Was his abrupt question. I am with Mrs. Clark. I know that's right. I'm not her servant. I am with her. I am her traveling companion. She thinks I'm her friend. Y'all know how I feel about that. It is all the same. Servants are not allowed to eat in the large dining room. Here, this way. You must take your dinner in the servants' hall. Now, I do understand why one would assume she was Mrs. Clark's servant, but she's not. Do y'all have Black people staying here who aren't people servants who are sitting in the dining hall? I have questions. Hungry and humiliated as I was willing to follow to any place to get my dinner, for I had been riding all day and had not tasted a mouthful since early morning. On reaching the servants' hall, we found the door of the room locked. The waiter left me standing in the passage while he went to inform the clerk of the fact. In a few minutes, the obsequious clerk came blustering down the hall. Did you come out of the street or from Mrs. Clark's room? From Mrs. Clark's room, I meekly answered. My gentle words seemed to quiet him, and then he explained. It is after the regular hour for dinner. The room is locked up, and Annie has gone out with the key. My pride would not let me stand longer in the hall. Very well, I remarked as I began climbing the stairs. I will tell Mrs. Clark that I cannot get any dinner. He looked after me with a scowl on his face. You need not put on airs. I understand the whole thing. What whole thing do you understand, sir? I said nothing, but I continued to climb the stairs, thinking to myself, well, if you understand the whole thing, it is strange that you should put the widow of ex-President Abraham Lincoln in a three-quartered room in the attic of this miserable hotel. That's what I'm saying. It would have been petty to have said that out loud, but, that's what I'm saying. When I reached Mrs. Lincoln's rooms, tears of humiliation and vexation were in my eyes. What is the matter, Lizzie? She asked. I cannot get any dinner. Cannot get any dinner? What do you mean? I then told her of all that had transpired below. The insolent, overbearing people, she fiercely exclaimed. Never mind, Lizzie. You shall have your dinner. Put on your bonnet and shawl. What for? What for? Why, we will go out of the hotel and get you something to eat where they know how to behave decently. And Mrs. Lincoln already was tying the strings of her bonnet before the glass. Her impulsiveness alarmed me. Surely, Mrs. Lincoln, you do not intend to go out on the street tonight? Yes, I do. Do you suppose I'm going to have you starve when we can find something to eat on every corner? But you forget. You are here as Mrs. Clark and not as Mrs. Lincoln. You came alone, and the people already suspect that everything is not right. If you go outside of the hotel tonight, they will accept the fact as evidence against you. Nonsense. What do you suppose I care for what these low bred people think? Put on your things. No, Mrs. Lincoln, I shall not go outside of the hotel tonight, for I realize your situation if you do not. Mrs. Lincoln has no reason to care what these people may say about her as Mrs. Lincoln, but she should be prudent and give them no opportunity to say anything about her as Mrs. Clark. While I am infuriated, I get what she's saying, particularly as a black person, and I'm meaning like a black person now. There are things I'm not going to do that my white friends will do. And I'm like, y'all are going to have to do that on your own. That's not my place in life. And it's not that I don't think it should be my place in life. Some of the things I don't want to do anyway, let's be honest. But it's not that I don't think it should be my place in life, but I am cognizant of what the consequences might be. And I often have this tension between what is right and just and what's going to keep me alive. What's going to keep me alive always wins. I have my moments, but like I feel Mrs. Keckley here. She's like, ma'am, they already think you're crazy and weird, and they're already not treating you well. What do you think is going to happen if you give them reason to believe even further that you're crazy and weird? They'll just treat you even worse. It was with difficulty I could convince her that she should act with caution. She was so frank and impulsive that she never once thought that her actions might be misconstrued. It did not occur to her that she might order dinner to be served in the room, so I went to bed without a mouthful to eat. Aw, not even room service? That's sad. The next morning, Mrs. Lincoln knocked at my door before 6 o'clock. Come, Elizabeth, get up. I know you must be hungry. Dress yourself quickly and we will go out and get some breakfast. I was unable to sleep last night for thinking of you being forced to go to bed without anything to eat. I dressed myself as quickly as I could, and together we went out and took breakfast at a restaurant on Broadway, someplace between 609 and the St. Denis Hotel. I do not give the number as I prefer leaving it to conjecture. Of one thing I am certain, the proprietor of the restaurant little dreamed who one of his guests was that morning. Y'all know my glasses are always falling down. Like I need them adjusted. But my headset that I wear, it's bone conduction, so it sits in front of my ear and it goes back behind my head and it sits better under my glasses. And then anytime I get my glasses adjusted, they get misadjusted because I'm putting this on. And before that, I was wearing masks. So I just push up my glasses incessantly. Let's keep reading. After breakfast, we walked up Broadway and entering Union Square Park, took a seat on one of the benches under the trees, watched the children at play, and talked over the situation. Mrs. Lincoln told me, Lizzie, yesterday morning I called for the Herald at the breakfast table, and on looking over the list of diamond brokers advertised, I selected the firm of I guess it's I don't know if it's the second. It's weird. I'm not like it's two Roman, so it's W, capital W, period, capital I, no space. Okay, capital W, period, space, capital I, period, space, Brady and Company. So is that like William? Is it WI? Is it W the second? Is it William the second? Like I am unsure how to read that for you. I'm going to say II. I selected the firm of WII Brady and Company, 609 Broadway. After breakfast, I walked down to the house and I tried to sell them a lot of jewelry. I gave my name as Mrs. Clark. I first saw Mr. Judd, a member of the firm, a very pleasant gentleman. We were unable to agree about the price. He went back into the office where a stout gentleman was seated at the desk, but I could not hear what he said. I know now what he said, and so shall the reader in parentheses. Mr. Brady has since told me that he remarked to Mr. Judge that the woman must be crazy to ask such outrageous prices and to get rid of her as soon as possible. Soon after Mr. Judd came back to the counter, another gentleman, Mr. Keyes, as I have since learned, a silent partner in the house, entered the store. He came to the counter and, in looking over my jewelry, discovered my name inside of one of the rings. I had forgotten the ring, and when I saw him looking at the name so earnestly, I snatched the bauble from him and put it into my pocket. I hastily gathered up my jewelry and started out. They asked for my address, and I left my card, Mrs. Clark at the St. Denis Hotel. They are to call to see me this forenoon when I shall enter into negotiations with them. Okay, this is so fraught with difficulty. One, for your jewelry and dresses really to be worth anything, people need to know that they are the jewelry and dresses of Mrs. Lincoln. Let's start there. Nobody's going to pay top dollar for Mrs. Clark's hand-me-down dress, but they will pay top dollar for Mrs. Lincoln's hand-me-down dress. Are they going to believe you're Mrs. Lincoln if you tell them? If you tell them up front, maybe. They'll do some digging to corroborate. But if you tell them after the fact, after they already saw your name in a ring, they're just going to think you stole all this stuff and you're trying to hawk hot material. Huh? Mrs. Lincoln, what? What have you gotten our friend Mrs. Keckley into? Oh my goodness. We're going to keep reading. How the police haven't shown up yet, I don't know. Maybe they won't. I don't know. I'm concerned. I have questions. We're going to keep reading. This one earring is oddly, oh, it's trapped inside the other earring. Like you see how that one's nice and this one's weird. It's, yeah, it's, or it's trapped inside of something. I'm not going to bother it right now. We're just going to keep on reading. Scarcely had we returned to the hotel when Mr. Keyes called and Mrs. Clark disclosed to him that she was Mrs. Lincoln. He was much elated to find his surmise correct. Mrs. L. exhibited to him a large number of shawls, dresses, and fine laces, and told him that she was compelled to sell them in order to live. He was an earnest Republican and much affected by her story, and denounced the ingratitude of the government in the severest terms. She complained to him of the treatment she had received at the St. Denis, and he advised her to move to another hotel forthwith. She readily consented, and as she wanted to be in an out-of-the-way place where she would not be recognized by any of her old friends, he recommended the Earl Hotel on Canal Street. Maybe he's a good citizen. I am leery. I am leery. I have concerns. I am concerned. I mean, and like, okay, tabloids are going to have this in a hot second, or he's going to like rip her off. I don't know. Maybe it's all going to turn out just fine. We'll see. On the way down to the hotel that morning, she acceded to a suggestion made by me and supported by Mr. Keyes that she confide in the landlord and give him her name without registering so as to ensure the proper respect. Unfortunately, the Earl Hotel was full and we had to select another place. We drove to the Union Place Hotel, where we secured rooms for Mrs. Clark, Mrs. Lincoln changing her mind, deeming it would not be prudent to disclose her real name to anyone. After we had become settled in our new quarters, Messrs. Keyes and Brady called frequently on Mrs. Lincoln and held long conferences with her. They advised her to pursue the course she did and were sanguine of success. Mrs. Lincoln was very anxious to dispose of her things and return to Chicago as quickly and as quietly as possible. But they presented the case in a different light, and I regret to say she was guided by their counsel. Okay, she regrets to say she was guided by their counsel. Yeah, the bad stuff is about to jump off here. I have a hard time making it through the bad stuff. I get really intensely involved with my characters, but I'm gonna be okay. We're gonna get through this. Who said Mr. Brady? Place your affairs in our hands, and we will raise you at least $100,000 in a few weeks. The people will not permit the widow of Abraham Lincoln to suffer. They will come to her rescue when they know she is in want. Oh dear. The argument seemed plausible, and Mrs. Lincoln quietly acceded to the proposals of Keyes and Brady. We remained quietly at the Union Place Hotel for a few days. On Sunday, Mrs. Lincoln accepted the use of a private carriage, and accompanied by me, she drove out to Central Park. We did not enjoy the ride much, as the carriage was a close one, and we could not throw open the window for fear of being recognized by some one of the many thousands in the park. Mrs. Lincoln wore a heavy veil so as to more effectually conceal her face. We came near being run into, and we had a spasm of alarm, for an accident would have exposed us to public gaze, and of course the masquerade would have been at an end. On Tuesday, I hunted up a number of dealers in second-hand clothing and had them call at the hotel by appointment. Mrs. Lincoln soon discovered that they were hard people to drive a bargain with, so on Thursday we got into a close carriage, taking a bundle of dresses and shawls with us, and drove to a number of stores on 7th Avenue, where an attempt was made to dispose of a portion of the wardrobe. The dealers wanted the goods for little or nothing, and we found it a hard matter to drive a bargain with them. Mrs. Lincoln met the dealers squarely, but all of her tact and shrewdness failed to accomplish much. I do not care to dwell upon this portion of my story. Let it answer to say that we returned to the hotel more disgusted than ever with the business in which we were engaged. There was much curiosity at the hotel in relation to us, as our movements were watched and we were regarded with suspicion. Our trunks on the main hall below were examined daily, and curiosity was more keenly excited when the Argus-eyed reporters for the Argus-eyed, Argus hyphen EYED, Argus. I know there was some sort of Greek ship called the Argo. We're going to look up Argus right quick. Now, normally I'll just keep moving, right? Like, you can't stop and look up everything you don't know. You use your context clues, but I just got nothing here for Argus. I mean, maybe like sneaky or shifty or dishonest. Okay, here, Argus, a long-tailed pheasant with generally brown plumage found in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, or a small brown or bluish Eurasian butterfly that typically has eye-like markings near the wing margins. Okay, Argus in Greek mythology. There's Argus Panoptes is a character in Greek mythology. He was a giant with 100 eyes on his body. Panoptes means all-seeing. Argus was a servant of the goddess Hera, and he made an excellent watchman because he never fell asleep. Okay, so Argus-eyed means all-seeing, I guess. Let's look up Argus-eyed. Okay, Argus-eyed is very vigilant or observant. That's like all-seeing. Okay, so it comes from Greek mythology. Look at us learning things. All right. Our trunks in the main hall below were examined daily, and curiosity was more keenly excited when the Argus-eyed reporters for the press traced Mrs. Lincoln's name on the cover of one of her trunks. The letters had been rubbed out, but the faint outlines remain, and these outlines only serve to stimulate curiosity. Messrs. Keyes and Brady called often, and they made Mrs. Lincoln believe that if she would write certain letters for them, now they're just banking on her name. Oh, that if she would write certain letters for them to show prominent politicians, they could raise a large sum of money for her. She's getting shafted. They argued that the Republican Party would never permit it to be said that the wife of Abraham Lincoln was in want, that the leaders of the party would make heavy advances rather than have it published to the world that Mrs. Lincoln's poverty compelled her to sell her wardrobe. No, they won't. They will not. They don't care. They will not. I'm doing like this because I watch EJ Speaks, her videos, and she does this a lot. She cracks me up. Okay. Okay. Mrs. L's wants were urgent, and she had to borrow $600 from Keys and Brady. I was wondering how she was paying for this hotel, but whatever. She had to borrow $600 from Keys and Brady, and she was willing to adopt any scheme which promised to place a good bank account to her credit. At different times in her room at the Union Place Hotel, she wrote the following letters. Oh, it's a bunch of letters. We'll read a couple of them. Chicago, September 18th, 1867. Mr. Brady, commission broker, number 609 Broadway, New York. I have this day sent to you personal property which I am compelled to part with and which you will find of considerable value. The articles consist of 4 camel hair shawls, 1 lace dress and shawl, a parasol cover, a diamond ring, 2 dress patterns, some furs, etc. Please have them appraised and confirmed by letter with me. Very respectfully, Mrs. Lincoln. And here's another letter. Chicago, Mr. Brady, number 609 Broadway, New York City. Dear Sir, the articles I am sending you to dispose of were gifts of dear friends, which only urgent necessity compels me to part with, and I am especially anxious that they shall not be sacrificed. The circum the circumstances are peculiar and painfully embarrassing. Therefore, I hope you will endeavor to realize as much as possible for them. Hoping to hear from you, I remain very respectfully, Mrs. A. Lincoln. So when she goes back to Chicago, she's just sending them things and like not knowing what is happening. Okay, so it's 1867. Sending anything was, an act of faith, but like you don't send them stuff and you don't get any money in the bank, ma'am. Oh, Mrs. Lincoln. September 25th, 1867. W.H. Brady, Esquire. My great sorrow and loss have made me painfully sensitive, but as my feelings and pecuniary comforts were never regarded or even recognized in the midst of my overwhelming bereavement, now that I am pressed in a most startling manner for means of subsistence, I do not know why I should shrink from an opportunity of improving my trying position. Being assured that all you do will be appropriately executed and in a manner that will not startle me very greatly and excite as little comment as possible, again I shall leave all in your hands. I am passing through a very painful ordeal, which the country, in remembrance of my noble and devoted husband, should have spared me. I remain, with great respect, very truly, Mrs. Lincoln. P.S. As you mentioned that my goods have been valued at over $24,000, I will be willing to make a reduction of $8,000 and relinquish them for $16,000. If this is not accomplished, I will continue to sell and advertise largely until every article is sold. I must have means to live, at least in a medium comfortable state. M.L. I'm going to read a little bit more. The letters were dated Chicago and addressed to Mr. Brady, though every one of them was written in New York. Okay, I was like, she's back in Chicago already. Okay, but no, she's still in New York. That's intriguing. For when Mrs. L left the West for the East, she had settled upon no definite plan of action. Mr. Brady proposed to show the letters to certain politicians and asked for money on a threat to publish them if his demands as Mrs. Lincoln's agent were not complied with. When writing the letters, I stood at Mrs. Lincoln's elbow and suggested that they be couched in the mildest language possible. Never mind, Lizzie, she said, anything to raise the wind. One might as well be killed for a sheep as a lamb. This latter expression was a favorite one of hers, she meaning by it that if one must be punished for an act, such as theft, for instance, that the punishment would be no more severe if a sheep were taken instead of a lamb. Wow, okay. So now Mrs. Lincoln is lying about where she is. This is a whole thing that Mrs. Lincoln has gotten our friend Mrs. Keckley into, and I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. Anyway, that's all we're doing for now on our second part of chapter 15. And by like the third or fourth part, I'm not going to remember which part we're on, but you will, because you're cool like that. So we are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda. Until next time.